Take it from me. Be there when your dad dies. It's not like there's a good time for it, and I may be biased, but I'm convinced 14 is the worst age to be when your dad dies. I suppose it depends on what stage of your life you're in. The worst age for some might be 17 to 34, but I'm talking averages here. I picked 14 because, well, I think that's when we appreciate our parents the least. My dad was old when I was born, 49, and despite the gulf between us, for the first dozen years of my life, we were as close as father and daughter could be. He worked as a carpenter, and my earliest and best memories were all standing hip high to him in his workshop in the garage. I was his little helper. I'd hand him tools and sweep up his sawdust. I knew what a carpentry plane was when I was 6 years old. I'd sing along with him to his Hank Williams, and when I grew up and developed my own musical tastes, he let me put my pop music on in the workshop. He probably hated it, but he even sang and hummed along because he loved me. I remember nights when I'd race through my homework just so I could stay up with him in the shop while he finished on a walnut trestle table or a cherrywood wardrobe. I was addicted to it all. The smell of the different wood shavings, the confidence on my father's hands, his loving smile that greeted me when I burst through the door to join him. My dad always worked late into the night, and I thought he was just in love with his work. I was too young to realize how hard he worked just to keep us out of poverty. He'd always come and tuck me into bed on the nights I didn't fall asleep watching him in his workshop. I'd giggle as some of the blonde dandruff of sawdust fell out of his beard as he pulled the covers to my neck and kissed my forehead goodnight. Life was never as good as it was in that little house on Chester Street. See, puberty hit. In the span of a few short months, carpentry was no longer cool, and my father wasn't my buddy. He was lame. His jokes that used to make me giggle caused my eyeballs to roll back to my brain. I was a broody teenager and found myself struggling with depression by the time freshman year rolled around. It didn't help that my dad was always worried about me. He'd knock gently on my door to see how I was doing on the nights when I disappeared into my room after dinner. He made a final effort before the hormones took over. I was in my room, staring at my computer when he knocked on the door. "What?" I asked, annoyed. He peeked his head in. "Hey, no pressure, but I could sure use an extra set of hands on this table trim I'm doing. You interested?" He gave me a half smile. He'd caught me in a particularly salty teenage mood. "I don't want to help you with your stupid carpentry. I'm old enough to know better." "Oh, you sure? I think you'd really like this trim set Yes, I interrupted him with a shout. "I'm sure, Dad. Sorry you don't have an unpaid helper anymore. Perhaps if you got an actual job, you could afford one." Why do hormones hunt for the cruelest words they can find? Even with my anger, my heart still hurt when I saw his smile fade into sadness. He pursed his lips, nodded at me, and shut my door gently. The next few months were filled with exchanges like that. I got really into drawing around then. I drew horror scenes, like Alice in Wonderland meets Stephen King. My dad hated horror. He got too afraid, and my mom and I would tease him for it. But still, around that time, he was always asking me what I was drawing. I shooed him away. It wasn't his thing anyways, so why did he care? It took me another couple years to realize he was just trying to bond in any new way that he could, now that carpentry was gone from my interests. But I never gave him the time of day. Then he got sick. Yeah, it was quick. Apparently, pancreatic cancer is the deadliest because it's so hard to detect. Once they find it's metastasized, spread too far to stop. My strong, lively father was reduced to a husk of himself in just months. Around February of my freshman year, he was sent back from the hospital for in-home hospice. I couldn't even comprehend the word hospice. My dad dying? I was older, but he was still immortal in my mind, oxen and confident. I couldn't stand to see him in what his deathbed would be. His chest and cheeks hollowed. On the first day he got back from the hospital, I sat by his bedside. It was just me and him. My mom was out, picking up his prescriptions that he didn't want because they would bankrupt us. "So, kiddo, you want to show me some of your drawings?" asked my father. I shook my head. I couldn't bring myself to cry. I was stoic, unbelieving. Reality was still so shocking that it felt fake. "Listen, I'm not going to mince words. I need you to go easy on your mother. She doesn't display emotion, but this is going to hurt her like hell and she's going to need you." I looked away from his eyes to keep myself from crying. We were quiet as he reached out and grabbed my hand. "Can I tell you something, sweetie?" I looked back to him. "Yeah." His breath quivered as he inhaled. "I'm scared." Tears rushed from both his eyes. "I had this idea that I'd smile to the end and give you and your mother the best version of myself to remember. But I'm terrified. I don't want to die." I pulled my hand away from his like it was hot. His words hollowed out my insides. I didn't think my dad was afraid of anything. To see him reduced to this made me scared. I was terrified. "I know I'm supposed to be your big, strong dad, but I'm dying, Katie. And I'm so damn afraid." "Yeah." It was all I said. I mean, I was 14. I wasn't emotionally prepared for this. I couldn't properly communicate my feelings about what I wanted for dinner, let alone how I felt about my dying dad. So I withdrew. I was scared to see him, and I went by his room as little as possible. He didn't pressure me. He was wise enough to understand how hard this was for me. One night when he was really fading, I went to the movies with a friend. It was the kind of escape I needed. I remembered staying in my seats as the credits rolled. I hated the feeling of reality settling in when I stepped out of the theater before my dad was sick. My phone had been off, and when I turned it back on, I saw that I had about a dozen missed calls from my mom. Her text said that my dad was fading and fast. I raced home in a teary panic. I couldn't believe how distant I'd been from him. I wanted to wrap my arms around him, to sob into his chest, tell him how sorry I was I hadn't been closer with him for the last couple of years, not just when he was sick. I burst through the front doors, confused to see the living room was full. My aunts, uncles, and a couple of cousins were there. Apparently, my dad had already passed. They gathered around him, holding his hand as his breath faded. I sat cross-legged on the floor. They still hadn't called the coroner. They were waiting for me to come home and say goodbye. But say goodbye to what? He was already gone. Before everyone left, my aunt turned to me. "You should have been here. He was calling for you. He wanted you there. Where's Katie?" Those were your dad's last words. Do you know that? "Janet, stop," said her son, but I could tell from everyone's faces that she was telling the truth. It all came out then. I'll spare you the worst details. What I didn't know was that would be the last night I spent in that house. My mom put me in a patient treatment center for the next month. I resented her for it at first, but looking back, she didn't have a choice. I went off the rails. I wasn't much better when I got out. My mom had moved across town to a dingy townhome. She thought we were better off in a place without those old memories hanging over us. I'm not sure she was right. After a loved one dies, our memories of them start as a fresh fruit. They're green, inedible, and too tough to swallow. The nostalgia seems useless, hurtful. But death ripens over time. Eventually, those memories sweeten. And while they're still smart, I know we're better off remembering. But it was too late for that. Dad's death did bankrupt us. We had to move. Now the train and the drunk neighbor next door took turns rattling our window frames with their roars. Dogs barked. Kids skipped school, and drugs and cash were exchanged in handshakes. And it wasn't long before I knew every secret handshake on the block. The next 4 years were hell. I couldn't hold a job, and if I did, my paychecks went to drugs and partying. There was no way I could afford to live on my own, or with roommates. So when I turned 18, my mom gave me an ultimatum. Go to community college or live on the street. She wouldn't have actually kicked me out into the street, but I still had a conscience. I wanted to make her happy. I enrolled for fall semester. The class I was most interested in was Ancient Lore and Spirituality in the Western Hemisphere. It sounded like an easy 3-credit course, and I got to learn about voodoo and shamans. I thought, what the hell? On my first day, I was surprised to find the classroom dark and lit entirely by a few candles. Most of the students chuckled a little when they came in. This was just the kind of course they were looking for. Our teacher was serious, however. She was a Caribbean woman with a thick accent. Her name was Mrs. DuPont. For introductions, she made us tell a local story we had heard about spirits. After half the class had gone, one student's story took me from my daydreaming. A kid with an alternative look, black clothes, studded belt, conductor's cap was talking. In 2018, some family moved in a house in the Piedmont neighborhood. Apparently, blood started seeping from the walls, and the husband and wife both had horrible nightmares night after night. Hey, one girl interrupted him. I've heard about that too. Another family moved in but didn't even last a month. Same thing, nightmares, moving furniture, satanic shit. Yeah, the alternative kid nodded. The house is vacant now, and rumor has it the bank won't even bring it to auction until rumors die down. Wait, I raised my hand awkwardly. Where's Piedmont? Chestnut Street, said the girl confidently. The house is on Chestnut Street. I stayed after everyone had left the classroom and approached Mrs. DuPont cautiously. Mrs. DuPont, do you have a minute? She paused and looked into my eyes. She had a wise and kind gaze, but she looked deeper than surface level. I felt seen. Sure, honey. What's troubling you? I told her everything. I didn't plan to, but she was one of the warmest people I've talked to in years. In a way, she reminded me of my father. You think this spirit is that of your father? Yeah, I nodded. I mean, it could be a different house. But 2018 Chestnut Street? It all adds up. Human spirits decide to stay when they die unsatisfied. Your father had an option to go to the great beyond, but he stayed. Was he a spiteful man in life? No, not at all. The hauntings he's put these people through don't sound like him. Death can do horrible things to a spirit. The hate of a life left unfulfilled can infect them. I want to help him. Mrs. DuPont lifted her brow cautiously. I don't think that is wise. What you know of your father is gone. If he's haunting and putting nightmares into people's minds, then his spirit has been corrupted. Before I could speak, she continued, but I don't plan to keep a mourning daughter from seeing her father. You will do what you will do, But I warn you, child, these hauntings are a sign that your father is a monster now, something you will not recognize. Do you understand me? I nodded and she undid a latch on her satchel bag. She pulled out a candle made of purple and black wax and a wick of white sage. Light this. It will at least protect you while you make this discovery for yourself. Life is one big stovetop, and unfortunately, we must be burned by everything in order to learn. Good luck. When the dimly lit classroom was behind me and I stood in the bright hall, I wasn't even sure I believed any of that crap. Spirits, ghosts, it all seemed like a joke. But Mrs. Dupont was wise. She knew I had to see it for myself. That night, I took the bus to my old neighborhood. I hadn't been there since. For 4 years, I'd actively avoided going anywhere near our old house. Now, I was standing directly in front of it. It was as ominous as a haunted house is supposed to look. I mean, it wasn't a Victorian mansion. It was a little Sears kit home, a common enough style of house in Wayne County, but the shutters were crooked and the paint was peeling. The home looked about as inviting as a dank cave. I looked over my shoulder as I went through the chain-link fence to the backyard. The bank had boarded the doors up to keep squatters and teens out, but someone had busted one of the basement windows. I dropped to my knees and crawled through. I was in the laundry room and my first instinct was to flip the light switch, but of course, no power. I stepped cautiously towards the basement stairs. Squatters and teen vandals had made short work of the place. The walls were covered in graffiti and fist-sized holes where drunk boys had punched the drywall. Sorry you don't have the best company, Dad. I'd be mad too, I said aloud. Then I remembered the ghost of my father had supposedly scared good families away. Maybe these drug-doing heathens were now more his spirit style. My heart stopped when I got to the living room. My hands became clammy and I wanted to run. All the hardwood had been pried up and beneath was a giant pentagram drawn in black paint. In its center was a curled mass of fur, a rabbit or some large rodent. That's not you, I said as if my dad could hear. I was sure this was probably also the doing of teen vandals. The rumors said it was a haunted house, and the local kids probably went with the theme of keeping things spooky. But I was done. This kind of thing wasn't me. I didn't believe in ghosts. My dad was dead, in the ground. His soul was not angry and lurking on earth. I turned back towards the basement stairs, but stood shocked still before I could go down them. There was a black silhouette of a person, of a man, large, like my father, at the foot of the basement stairs. Dad? I stuttered, but the shadow didn't respond. I backed up slowly and then pivoted and ran. The back door was covered in a sheet of plywood, but thankfully the wood it was nailed into had rotted and I burst through it into the backyard. I thought about screaming, but then I thought better. I'd made enough noise busting out of the house. I already heard a dog barking next door. The last thing I wanted was to have to deal with the police. I stepped quickly towards the gate that led to the front so I could get back to the street, but the shadow I'd seen in the basement was blocking my path. It was undoubtedly my father. It's funny how our minds don't always need faces or voices. The simple shape of him I knew by heart. But I wasn't happy to see it. His cold black form left me breathless. I ran again, this time the only direction I had left. I went straight into the garage and locked the door behind me. I was trapped, unless I wanted to call the police. My mind suddenly raced to if I was even safe or not. I'd never heard of anybody being murdered by ghosts. But then again, maybe that's because such cases remain unsolved. I backed up slowly, running my hands across the workbench to hopefully have to hammer. an empty bottle, anything I could use as a weapon. But then the lights came on. A saw hummed as it idled. I turned around and stared at awe. My father's workshop was just as it had been the last time I saw it. I was blinking away disbelief when suddenly the smell of sawdust made me go numb with nostalgia. "Fuck," I said out loud. The big circular saw whirled to life, and I just about jumped out of my skin. The blade came down and sank through a 2x10 board, and the cloud of dust settled around the shape. Broad shoulders, a big bushy beard. My breath stuttered as I exhaled. "Dad?" The saw went down into the 2x10 again and again, notching it, making little divots and shallow cuts. I realized that saw was writing. I walked closer skeptically. I watched the saw work, looking up and down in shock. After a few minutes, the saw died and I leaned over the board. "Sorry for the scare," I said aloud, reading what was sawn into the wood. "I can't communicate in the house. It seemed like my soul is stuck in this workshop." I looked up at the saw blade as it revved a few times, as if in affirmation of what I was reading. I exhaled a laugh. "My Katie, I've haunted a few families out of here in hopes you would hear the tales. In hopes that you would return here to find me. I thought I made for a pretty spooky ghost. And would you look at that? A plan came together. You can ask me yes or no. 1 spin is yes, 2 is no." That was the end of the writing. I looked up at the saw. "Are you talking about communicating with this saw?" The saw spun once. I looked around for a hidden camera. Then I realized it probably didn't make for good YouTube content to prank a girl about her dead dad coming back to life. Or who knows? I hadn't been on YouTube for a while. Maybe that'd be a hit. "Dad, is this you? Seriously?" Another single spin. I reached out to where the sawdust had first shown his form, but I couldn't feel anything. "Why can't I touch you?" The saw was silent. Right, yes or no only." I chewed my lip trying to think of a question. "Can you show yourself?" The saw spun once. "Then why don't you?" The blade stayed on and started to move down. I flinched back as it started writing on 2x10 again. When the sound died, I leaned forward to read. "It will take everything I have, and it won't be for long." I looked at the saw. "You mean you won't be around anymore?" It responded with a single turn. "Well, Dad, if you're really here, you can come say hi. Or I guess you can just spend eternity as this old saw. But that probably doesn't sound awful to you, does it?" The saw revved once, and I laughed, but I was quickly silenced. A wind began to blow, and a little cyclone of sawdust built up. When it settled, there, smiling at me sadly, was my dad. "Oh," I choked on my words. "Oh my God," I said and began to cry. "It's okay, sweetheart, but you've got to keep it together for a minute or two because we don't have much time." I nodded. "I'm sorry." "You ain't got nothing to be sorry about." "I'm sorry I wasn't there," I sobbed. "I'm sorry I was so mean. I'm sorry you had to die when your only child was at the fucking mall." Hey, it's all right. What movie did you see?" "I don't know," but I did remember. I remembered every damn detail of that night, down to the milk dud that was stale and cracked on my teeth. "Ready Player One." "Was it any good?" "No." I sobbed and broke down into cries. It sucked. Hey now, you didn't do anything wrong. I did everything wrong, I blurted out in a snotty cry. No, teenagers are supposed to fall away from their fathers. It's my job to love you all the same. And cancer, well, what's scarier than that? You were calling for me the night you died. You needed me there and I was too scared, too stupid. I wasn't calling for you because I needed you, Katie. I was calling for you because I knew you needed to be there. Otherwise, you'd hate yourself. I knew the guilt would eat you for the rest of your life, and I was so scared of that. He paused. It was all I could think about. In the end, I wasn't even scared of my own death. I was just scared of what it would do to you. I was crying too much to get a breath in. My dad came near to me and put his arms around me. Although they were weightless, I still felt like they held me with a strength. But sometimes we don't get to say goodbye. The last time you see someone you love, you might say something you regret. You might hurt them. You might act like you'll see them again to set things right, but that won't always be the case. Sometimes people die at the worst time, and it happens every day. But take it from me, my darling. Take it from the dead. We don't hold it against you. Not one bit. I love you, I squeaked out. Can't you stay? Appearing to you now is taking all my spirit's strength. I'm going to go soon. Where? I don't know. Do you think I'll see you again? Oh, sweetheart. Like this, maybe. But I know you'll see me in everything you do. I love you. I love you too, Dad. I pressed my eyes shut tight, and when I opened them, the garage was dark. The smell of sawdust gone. The workbench was stained and bloated from rot, and the rusty blade of the circular saw wasn't shiny enough to even catch the moonlight. It took me a long time to leave, and when I did, I walked home slowly, 7 miles in the dark. I think I finally figured out what my dad meant by how I'll see him in everything I do. He didn't mean I'd find him at the bottom of a pipe bowl or a liquor bottle. No, I see him a lot, but often it's only when I'm in my workshop, gliding my carpentry plane along and smiling to the sweetest smell of sawdust. After all, I think I make a pretty good carpenter, like father, like daughter.